Okay, thank you to everybody for attending this afternoon. I know it's a very busy time of the year for everybody. As with Brent, this is going to be a very high-level overview, actually in this case of a number of related projects that I've been working on over the past couple of years. This actually turned out to be quite an interesting opportunity to stop for a minute and look back over the last 2.5 years, because I think all of us as academics experience the day-to-day guilt of feeling like we're not doing enough and we're not writing enough. And it's quite nice to stop and pause and go, oh, actually, I did do some things in the last few years. So my project is Conspiracy Belief and its Influence on Political Behaviors. It's a very high-level title that hasn't changed since the outset. And to give a little bit of background on that title and on my research, prior to joining WIAS, I had two key areas of focus. The first of those was Japanese politics. I wrote my PhD thesis on the LDP and its internal structures. But I had also during that time been involved in a number of projects around populism and polarization, which are these two very key trends that we've seen across both the developed and developing world in the last 10 to 15 years. And I had particularly been looking with some colleagues at the ways that we use survey research to measure populist attitudes and social polarization. And I'd started doing some work to try to build that out and use social media data to achieve similar measurements. During that process, I had become personally increasingly convinced, I can't speak for my co-authors, that conspiracy theory beliefs were a very important factor in both populist attitudes and social polarization. And essentially, no matter how or where we were studying these trends of polarization and of populism, all roads seemed, to me at least, to lead back to some form of conspiracy beliefs. And that's the project that I proposed, was to look in more depth at conspiracy beliefs, particularly as they relate to these threats to democracy that we've seen in recent years, and particularly to populism. There were three key issues that I identified in conspiracy theory research that I wanted to look into, and I still think these are very active and important issues. The first is that it's inherently Anglocentric, Eurocentric. Almost all research on conspiracy theories and on the people who believe them has been conducted either in Europe or in Anglosphere countries like the United States or Canada. So this is a significant issue because it means that we just have very little information and certainly no sort of structured studies of what's going on with conspiracy theory belief in the developing world or in East Asia or anywhere else. There's an assumption that people make that these are going to be structured in broadly the same way, and I'm not sure that assumption actually holds terribly well. The second is that most of the work on conspiracy theory belief had treated it as an effect and not as a cause. So most of the work on conspiracy theory belief up until relatively recently has tended to come from a political psychology or a pure psychology perspective, and is interested in why people believe in conspiracy theories and trying to understand whether there is some underlying propensity or some psychological correlate that would explain why people choose to believe in these types of conspiracy theories. And that sort of leaves out the second part of the equation, which is what happens when people believe conspiracy theories? What does it do to their ability to trust institutions and other people around them? What does it do to their political behaviors? What does it do to their faith in democracy? And we all have a hunch based on the events of the last few years that the answer is nothing good, but we need to actually have some proper research to understand the role that conspiracy theories play within threats to democracy or within the democratic functioning of a country, and whether that is different from country to country or from region to region. And the third problem, which is one that I think affects a lot of studies of contemporary politics, but is really, really a major problem in conspiracy research, is that it is constantly lagging behind reality. Research is slow. I mean, research itself is slow, and as we all know, then getting a paper published is extremely slow. But this, in contrast, conspiracy theories are incredibly fast to develop. They can develop and change over a matter of hours or days. And what we've seen increasingly in research is that researchers are trying to keep up with this. They're trying to ask people about the beliefs that are currently being distributed and being disseminated in online communities. But by the time they get around to getting through an IRB or to designing a survey or to getting out into the field to ask people questions in interviews, the things they're asking about are already weeks old, and people will say, oh, I don't believe that anymore. And it no longer resonates with them. Your questions are out of date. So this is a significant problem. That's an extreme example of it, but definitely we see a lot of research being published that's talking about conspiracy theories that, for example, versions of the QAnon conspiracy theories that were already out of date 2 or 3 years ago. So this is an issue when it comes to trying to measure the extent to which people actually believe these things or the effects they have. So my original plan when I came here was to run a series of surveys, mostly focusing on understudied countries, and to combine this with social media research to try to explore the nature of conspiracy beliefs in those regions and to contrast it with what we already know about the developed world, or the European Anglo-centric research we already have. The final objective of this was to propose a new survey scale that would more effectively measure conspiracy beliefs cross-nationally, and that would hopefully also include some indications of the connection between conspiracy belief and political behaviors. So, as I said earlier, voting versus abstention or support for political violence. This would allow us to explore in different regional contexts whether there are some countries where conspiracy theories are very deeply connected to something problematic like support for political violence, other areas perhaps where a lot of people believe conspiracy theories, but we don't see that same support for political violence coming through. And initially, although as I said, I had this Japan politics focus in my prior research, I had wanted to include Japan as a case study, but I wasn't considering it to be an especially important case. No plan survives contact with the enemy in this case being reality. And so almost as soon as I joined WIAS, there were a couple of things which demanded, to me personally, or I felt like they demanded that I adapt and adjust this plan and focus more on the Japanese case. The first of these is that around the start of 2022 and leading through into the spring of that year, we saw anti-vaccine and anti-mask demonstrations, kind of anti-COVID countermeasure demonstrations in cities across Japan, which had been taking place for some time, but really started to get very large around January of 2022. And they never reached the point of being like thousands and thousands of people on the streets, but you would see hundreds getting up into the low thousands of people who were demonstrating against vaccines and so on. And if you looked at the signs that they were carrying, there was some really serious conspiracy theory stuff being sort of expressed by the participants in these demonstrations in cities around Japan almost every weekend through spring of 2022. And this culminated when the members of a conspiracy group called Yamato Q that had become much larger and more aggressive over the course of these demonstrations, they started attacking vaccination clinics and breaking into vaccination clinics and trying to break equipment and stuff. And 14 of them were ultimately arrested for that. So this was a very major and unusual and unexpected development in Japan, where that sort of direct political action has been very rare in recent years. Then, of course, in July of that year, former Prime Minister Abe was assassinated. Now, the person who assassinated him wasn't a conspiracy theorist, but there was a huge amount of conspiracy theory around that assassination event. A massive wave of conspiracy theories spread online. And we've seen actually a very, very similar event to that in just recent days where, huge amounts of conspiracy theorizing around the attempted assassination of former President Trump just a couple of days ago. So this type of event really seems to set off a wave of online conspiracies. And just a couple of days after that, unconnected to the assassination, but in the election that followed, this gentleman called Kamiya Sohei, who was a representative for a new political party called Sanseito, was elected to the upper house of the Diet. And Sanseito is an explicitly conspiracy theory political party. Their whole worldview is very strongly focused around conspiracy theories, and they have a very unusual and interesting structure for a political party as well. So these are all things that made the Japanese case feel much more relevant and much more important than it had been when I was originally designing this research. So I split my research really into a two-track approach. First of all, I refocused it to have a lot more focus on investigating the Japanese case and hopefully revealing and explaining that Japanese case to an international and comparative audience. But I also wanted to maintain a lot of aspects of that original cross-national research design. So I'm continuing with the survey research approach, and I've worked with a number of colleagues, both here at WIAS and elsewhere in Waseda and at other universities, to develop and test new survey items on conspiracy theories and political violence and anti-elite attitudes, and try to find the connections between these things in a number of different national contexts. And alongside this, I've also been conducting two separate investigation projects into how conspiracy theories are created and disseminated in Japan, and how political actors in Japan have been using conspiracy rhetoric to try to drum up support and to build engagement with their constituencies. So to go through these at a very high level briefly, one by one, in terms of the survey research, beginning in 2022, I built out a battery of questions on conspiracy theories and have been testing these alongside some new items that I built with some colleagues about support for political violence and anti-elite attitudes. And we've tested these in the Philippines in pre and post-presidential election surveys in 2022 and 2023. We just ran a very early pre-election survey in the United States with Sato Sensei from WIAS. We were able to include these items in a survey in Brazil earlier this spring, and we'll have these items run in Hungary and Japan later this year. Well, probably Japan. It depends on whether we ever get an election. Working with Sebastian Junkens, who's a German scholar I've done a lot of this work with, and with Hino Sensei from Waseda, we just got a study accepted at Political Studies, which is based on a slightly earlier version of these batteries. And we're now working on a broader comparative study using the data from the other countries that were surveyed. The study that just got accepted or the paper that just got accepted is focused specifically on the 2020 elections. That also gives you a hint at how long it took to get that paper through the peer review process. This is actually some of the findings from that paper. And it's one of the key ones so far that I think sort of supports my initial hypothesis or my initial inclination to focus on conspiracy theories. These results are showing us essentially that conspiracy beliefs were much more predictive of support for political violence than populist attitudes, both among Trump and Biden supporters in 2020. And in fact, we only found an effect of populist attitudes among people who already were showing high support or high belief in conspiracy theories. So if you are a conspiracy theory believer, you may be further activated by holding populist attitudes. But if you're not a conspiracy theory believer, populist attitudes don't seem to push you towards support for political violence. So this really supports the idea that conspiracy theories are the really fundamental factor in play here. This is actually a further piece of survey research work. This was published in Chuo Koron late last year, and it used data from Japanese surveys we had conducted in 2019, 2021, and 2022. This is probably very hard to read on Zoom, but essentially what all of these are showing, this is a series of different conspiracy theories, top to bottom. For almost all of them, we saw a significant drop in Japanese citizens' tendency to express any form of belief in the conspiracy since the pandemic. And my suggested explanation here is that after having seen the Capitol riot, after having seen the anti-vaccine demonstrations and heard about people refusing vaccines and so on, a lot of people who had previously thought of conspiracy theories as being a kind of silly, fun thing that you see in a Hollywood movie are now actually beginning to view them as a socially dangerous thing. And they no longer are willing to entertain them. They reject them much more profoundly than they did prior to the pandemic. So that's actually a very positive thing from a Japanese standpoint, because it is not what we are seeing in most Western countries. Speaking further to the Japanese case, the next study I conducted is based on a collection of large-scale Twitter data that was gathered directly after the assassination of Abe Shinzo in 2022. And this is a network and text analysis approach to attempting to understand how the conspiracy theories developed in the days immediately after the event, and the sort of identity and structure of the network through which they were disseminated. So I've presented this at a number of conferences, both here in Japan and in the United States. And there has been a paper on this project awaiting a journal review decision, and my countdown clock tells me we just passed the 6-month mark on that. So the comment I made earlier about science being slow was coming from a place of deep bitterness. This is some of the findings from that. This is a graph showing the people who were directly involved in authoring conspiracy theories in the 14 days after the assassination. And the smaller dots on this graph are the people who then disseminated those conspiracy theories out to their wider networks. The key finding really is that this was a very closely connected group. They were all in contact with each other long before this event. So this is really something that was happening within a very small, tight-knit community. And the ideas were being iterated on very fast. New versions of conspiracy theories kind of coming through as they iterated on each other's work on an hour-to-hour basis. The ideas were disseminated by this larger set of about 500 other accounts, but combined they had a reach of many millions of followers on Twitter and were able to seriously amplify these ideas out to a wide audience. I did some work looking at exactly who these people are and kind of what sort of media environment they live within themselves. And the key finding was that although they're not high-profile right-wing kind of nettoyo accounts in and of themselves, they are deeply embedded in that media space. And what this graph is really showing is that the gray bars are indicative of, you know, how popular certain media accounts are on Japanese social media. The red bars show what proportion of these sort of conspiracy theorist accounts follow them. And you can see it's just almost a complete X shape in the middle there. They exclusively follow and share information from far-right sources that are very little known among general Japanese public. So this really kind of highlights the importance of the filter bubble. And it's an early indicator of something that a number of other researchers have pointed out, which is that since 2022, the conspiracy theory sort of community, which used to be this strange fringe all of its own, has come to increasingly overlap with the far right and the hardcore nationalist communities in Japan. Which leads me on to the final project I've been working on related to conspiracies and Japanese politics. And this is really a focus on Sanseito, the party that I mentioned a little bit earlier on. This is a party that appeared during the pandemic. Many of its early leaders and key figures are actually people who come from a background as YouTubers and influencers rather than being politicians, although some of them had failed in previous political candidacies. They won an upper house seat in 2022, and they won 100 seats in the local elections, the combined local elections in 2023. They really promote this kind of conspiracy worldview. It's very different from a party that just adopts certain aspects of conspiracy rhetoric. Their whole worldview is based on the idea that there is a grand conspiracy against the ordinary people of Japan. And that stems initially from anti-vaccine activism, and it now encompasses a range of conspiracy theories, broadly speaking under the heading of anti-globalism, but there's a lot of kind of agrarian, agricultural conspiracies. They think people are interfering with the food supply, people are interfering with medicine, and it also connects to a lot of nationalist and they have a very strongly anti-China stance in particular, which of course appeals to right-wing nationalists. A lot of their conspiracy theories are Western conspiracy theories that would be very, very familiar to QAnon or kind of right-wing groups in the West, but then are adapted with specific elements for a Japanese audience. And that adaptation process is also sort of interesting from a research perspective. I have two papers on Sanseito that I've been working on with my research assistant. Both of these are basically finished at this point and being submitted. The first of these is on the development and appeal of those conspiracy beliefs and the structure of them, which we are submitting this week. And the second is looking at the way that Sanseito has actually been, for all its strangeness of its beliefs, it has a very, very interesting and innovative party in terms of how it has evolved the digital party structure. Digital parties have often had a problem where they're very good at attracting a lot of members, but very bad at attracting a lot of finance, because their members can just sign up on a web page and they can say, oh, we have 500,000 members, but it's very difficult to get those people to actually turn out to campaign or to donate or to generally be more involved than just clicking a button on a web page. Sanseito has managed to really leverage a lot of influencer marketing strategy because they have this experience as YouTubers and so on. And they've created this very significant media platform and a membership program, which is actually about 10 times as expensive as being a member of any other political party in Japan, and yet has about 50 to 70,000 members at the moment. The consequence of that is, even though they have very few elected officials, their direct revenue, the latest year that we have figures for is 2022, their direct revenue in that year was higher than any opposition party or than any LDP faction, which is extraordinary for such a small fringe party. And something that became very clear in the Tokyo 15th district by-election a couple of months ago is that they have also been very effective at training their members to actually turn out and campaign and be involved as volunteers in person. And so they have a really high presence in street politics. The picture here is of a Sanseito sort of street speech-making event, and you see these almost every weekend in busy parts of Tokyo when other political parties are almost invisible to this extent. This paper is also pretty much finished, and this is going to be presented at the ECPR General Meeting in Dublin next month. So there's already a venue for this in terms of a conference. I've also been working on a number of other things related to Japanese politics, which I won't talk about in too much depth, but I've kind of been keeping my thumb in the pie to some extent with some other Japanese politics related projects. And in terms of what's next for this, so I received a new Kakenhi Kiban C grant to continue the work on conspiracy theories as of this April. And specifically, that's looking at the ways in which conspiracy theories are deployed in political rhetoric. I think this tendency of both fringe politicians like Sanseto and also in some countries, mainstream politicians to start using conspiracy theories is a very important trend to investigate in the coming years. And also, of course, we're now building this trove of survey data on conspiracy theories and elitism and political violence. And one of the main things I'm working on over this summer, as well as our own analysis of it, is trying to make that data set publicly available and usable for other researchers. And so this is a quick and very hard to read list of everything I've done over the last couple of years. And I'd love to hear any kind of questions or comments.